to the top. I'm going to go to the desk and say, you're all thinking about sustainable planting at home? Yeah? Excellent. I'm in the right room.
It's more like how
Great.
I used to see it.
So this is, it'll be sort of an informal chat. We have prepared some slides with some general information. Do our best to be verbatim and sort of have more of an organic chat here. The idea is just to provide some information on options that you can explore at home to sort of create sustainable gardens, benefit the pollinators, and focus on more native species and such plants within your gardens. My part today will be to talk a little bit about what the county has done in the last little while, some initiatives that we've done and things we're looking at doing. And we'll be joined by both of these wonderful individuals, and they'll bring their experience to the talk. So why don't we begin? Maybe I'll man the slideshow. Is that Good. Great.
So I'll take this one. This basically is kind of what I would say are the top 3 things to be thinking about with sustainable planting at home in your garden. So number 1, Beth Chaddow, who was a gardener in the UK. Also, can everyone hear at the back?
Not very well. Not very well. Not well. Yes.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay.
And we can tell who's smoking.
Yeah. Okay. So the first rule is a rule stolen from Beth Chaddow, who was a famous gardener in England. She passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, but she was one of the pioneering people in terms of thinking about ecological planting. And her philosophy was right plant, right place. So that's really this foundational idea where you have to understand your site first and foremost before you try to plant it. Because really what ends up happening is, as all of us gardeners know, if you have to force and sort of coddle and baby something, it's really telling you it's not meant for that place. So everything kind of starts from that. The second kind of key idea is that plant diversity is what drives wildlife diversity. So the more diverse a garden you have in terms of plant species, the more diverse a garden you'll have in terms of insects, which then leads on to bird species and so on up the food chain. And number 3 really comes down to, again, it's about creating habitat, but it's also about minimizing the labor of gardening, which is if you can plant really densely, as this diagram shows, sort of thinking about layers of planting, so trees down to shrubs, down to perennials, down to ground covers. If you can fill all of those niches in space, it just minimizes how many little gaps are left open for weeds. So you get the benefit of having this nice, richly planted landscape, but it also is going to take much less work because all of the space is filled with, ideally, something desirable. And I would just reference, this is an image from a book called Planting in a Post-Wild World by Thomas Rayner and Claudia West. Fantastic resource if you're interested in this kind of idea. So again, some of the benefits of this approach. Again, if you start from the right plant, right place, that's generally how you can get plants that will establish and exist on rainfall, so you don't have to keep watering them through the heat of the summer. That's always kind of one of the key criteria for me when I'm designing a garden is, can these plants survive once they're established on the rain that falls from the sky? So ideally, there's no watering that needs to happen through the heat of the summer. If we get, an insane drought like we've had a few years where there's, you go months without rain, then obviously things will need a bit of supplemental irrigation, but the key idea is plants should be able to live on the rain that falls from the sky. You also need less pesticides and fertilizers when these plants are better suited to their environment. Like I said, habitat for insects, less weeding as long as you densely fill the space with plants. And the benefit for people is really you get this really dynamic, constantly changing landscape. So the garden looks one way in early April, one way in early May, a totally different way in July, and then by the fall it's changed completely again. So you get these seasonal moments over the course of a year where if you had a garden full of 3 plants, it might change 1 or 2 times over the course of the year. It's more of a static thing. So there's benefits for us too in terms of beauty and aesthetics that can come from this approach. And benefits for pollinators too, so I'll let Bay take that part of it.
So the habitat that provides for pollinators is amazing. One of the biggest problems that we have right now with keeping honeybees is that there's a combination of things happening. There's a loss of habitat. I'm going to stand up so you can hear me. There's a loss of habitat for bees, mainly from farming and from development, from buildings. So the human impact on the environment is taking away the flowers, but also then planting crops that they don't provide any food for honeybees specifically, is what I work with, but all the insects are in the same situation as honeybees now. So they don't get enough to eat, and then these crops are sprayed with insecticides, and so the insects die. So one of the things that we try to do is encourage people to plant flowers that are good for bees, but also any flower, because different insects like different types of flowers, and it's not just about honeybees for me, it's about biodiversity. So I guess, yeah, like it's interesting now that people are actually thinking about planting wildflowers, because we've spent so much time trying to get rid of everything that just naturally grows and replace it with what we think is beautiful. And it's a complete change in aesthetics, really, for people to decide, I want this to be a wild flower garden. And we also have the issue of there are a lot of plants that have become naturalized in the environment that we don't want growing in our gardens. And so that becomes like a real, like, it's almost like a philosophical struggle, right? Where you're looking at your garden and going, this wants to grow here now, but it's not from here and it's not beneficial to my garden. So that's where I get really sort of back and forth with this type of thing is, you know, this morning I spent a lot of time in my garden digging out catnip. My cats were hanging around a lot and excited about it, but I wanted to plant some vegetables there. So I'm digging out all these things that would be good for insects, but it's not like I don't have a lot of other space where it's growing around the veggie garden. But it makes me think about it a lot, right? Like I'm putting a lot of work into taking something out that would be good for all of the insects around here.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things too, because we can get sort of bogged down in terms of just thinking about native species are good and non-native species are bad. But there's a lot of non-native species. I mean, there are a lot of non-native species that are bad. Things like dogthorn, vine, and buckthorn, and all these things that are the scourges of our landscape. But also things like catnip, or even, I mean, as strange as it is to sound, the wild parsnip, which is an awful invasive plant. If you look at that plant in the summer when it's in flower, it's covered in insects. It's just spectacular for insects. So it's a really interesting kind of dilemma, because it is a non-native invasive plant that is displacing our native plants, but it also has some sort of value on its own, which is, again, it's a question of values and philosophy, which is interesting.
This is me again. Yeah, so I guess just the idea that insects do so many things in the environment, and we're really used to thinking of them as pests. And it's been a real shift in my thinking working with bees. I've been keeping bees for 22 years now, and it's made me consider insects in a totally different way. So I'm not as put off by insects, like I want to know what they do, and I'm more curious about them. Everything that we use plants for in our life is reliant on insects, basically. The plants don't live without them. And we're constantly killing insects with the activity that we carry on throughout all different parts of our life. And so we're losing plants that make our clothes and make our furniture and everything around us, not just our food, not just our, the easy things to see are like fruits and vegetables, but it goes really far beyond that. And basically what it comes down to for me is choosing, first of all, to buy less things. But if you are going to buy things for your garden, a lot of things that are sold as bee-friendly flowers are actually treated with chemicals that kill bees. So it's really important to ask when you're buying a plant if it's been sprayed with insecticides, for starters, or if the seeds were treated with neonicotinoids, which kill all kinds of insects. So you could be planting a beautiful flower garden and you could be killing all the insects with it. And then, of course, you know, your clothing and your food. If you're buying organic as much as you can, as much as you possibly can find it to buy, then you're at least not supporting that system that's killing insects. And I think it's important to also say that, like, birds eat insects and they're not able to find enough food now. There are actually 2 books that came out in the last year. One of them is called The Insect Apocalypse or something like that, and then there's another one about insect extinction. And basically it's like people have been writing books just in the last year about what's happening. Why are the insects all disappearing? And it's agricultural chemicals for the most part.
That brings us to my portion here. So I think one of the key takeaways here is, you know, we're reducing a lot of habitat, removing a lot of habitat, but we also have a lot of opportunity. We also have a lot of space as individuals, as property owners, as you know, as a county, to perhaps convert some of the space that's not being used beneficially to something that is beneficial. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the examples that we've undertaken at the county, things that we're trying to do to sort of do our part to go in the right direction in a lot of these issues. I guess the first example would be the Delhi Park Demonstration Garden. So the county has gotten funding from the CWF, so Canadian Wildlife Federation, to plant some more pollinator-friendly gardens. So a demonstration garden in the Delhi Park next to the footbridge, and also some right-of-way redevelopment. So changing some of the grass that is within some of the right-of-ways and moving them towards native plants that are pollinator-friendly. Big shout out to the Horticultural Society and specifically Lise for all the help with everything she's done on those projects. They've been going very well. So you'll see some of that taking root this year. Delhi Park specifically, right away. The location's yet to be determined, but we're working on that. Tree planting initiatives are also have been a big push the last little while. Last year we got started on actually putting some trees back in the ground. So we were able to plant quite a few trees, again with the help of a lot of folks, community individuals, Treaty County, Susan Banks, Lee's as well, and many others. Probably some other folks who are here tonight, and we thank you for the help for that. We'd like to continue that this year. So we have other plans for different sites to put more trees in. And not only that, work on a seedling giveaway, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, and which is coming up in the next little while here, so next weekend. Again, just to increase the number of plants and sort of utilize some of that space that's not being beneficially used and put more biomass in. And the last thing is an invasive species mapping initiative. So we've talked about invasive species, a few different things here already this afternoon. The first step to making any action on that is knowing what you have and where. And so the idea here is to sort of have the public help us identify where some of these species might be located, and that information can be used at a later date to figure out what to do. How big is the problem? What are the options? What can be done? I'll provide just a little more detail about some of the other things that are being undertaken by the county. The first being the Millennium Lookout. I'm not sure if you've been around there recently, but you'll notice a big patch of mulch that's being applied to the ground there. An interesting, I guess, technique, and we might talk a little more about this later, that's being employed there is to get rid of the native, sort of not native grass. The grass is growing there. We put down some cardboard and some newspaper and cover it with mulch in order to sort of stunt the growth of whatever's happening, whatever is there already. And then you'll come back in later with some plugs and punch through that material and plant the native species underneath that. So that's one technique. We'll probably talk about other techniques later, but just consider that as an option if you have a space that already has a well-established body of grass. I know it's working, seems to be working okay on our sites. We'll see how it does in a couple of years. So we have the Delhi Park Demonstration Garden. That's with the CWF partnership. And again, like I had mentioned before, that's near the footbridge. I understand that's been mulched recently, so you'll see that if you're walking through the park. Again, thanks to Lee's and the Horticultural Society, we appreciate that. We have the right-of-way pollinator planting, and also some other naturalization efforts that have gone on in Delhi Park. So if you've been there in the last, I would say, year, you'll notice there's a berm of mulch along the one side along the creek, Marsh Creek, and you'll see a number of different plants and plants that we put in there. So speckled alders, some willows, and a number of other things. I think there's ironweed, I believe.
Spirea.
So different things in there, and there hopes to be more collaboration with the Conservation Authority going forward. So this year as well, if there's funding available for that. And so it's not only just the county that's undertaking some of these projects. Hydro One is actually pretty active in a lot of their corridors, and their good example is the Millennium Trail. So if you go near, I believe it's Johnson Street, in between there and 49, you'll see that they have a large section that they've naturalized. And there's now some signage up that kind of indicates what they've done and where it's located. And if you're there in the summertime, it's a beautiful sight to see. The black-eyed Susans are quite vibrant and doing really well in that neighborhood. Here's just a couple shots of Delhi Park, and this is the Queen Conservation Authority's work. We had some staff assist with them, and again, a number of community volunteers got involved. And the idea here was to tackle the wild parsnip, which was basically taking over in parts down there. As you can see on the left, that's just a field of wild parsnip that was grown. And part of the efforts was to replace it with more aggressive native plants that can outcompete some of those non-native plants. So we're hoping that it works. We'd like to see progress in a year or so, see what happens. But ideally, the alders, the willows, and the other things will push back, and perhaps we'll have less of those invasives. And just another elaboration here from the county perspective on the tree planting, some different things that we have going on. We have the tree management and preservation policy. So I'm sure many have heard about that. And that emphasizes planting native species. So it's coded right into our policy. If we're putting trees back in the ground, they have to be native, or they have to be there non-native, but for a good reason. So in certain cases, another species might do better, and might be better to combat some non-natives. So we would make that selection. But generally speaking, the idea is native trees where possible, and to achieve diversity. As everyone has probably been aware to a certain degree, ash trees are becoming a problem in emerald ash borer. And the idea here is to replace them with a diverse set of trees, native trees, that if there are diseases in the future, that we're not seeing as big a die-offs. We're not seeing this issue where you have hundreds and hundreds of ash trees that have to clean or to address. So some of the planting projects that we've worked on, again with community groups, planting in Delhi Park, quite a number of trees went in there. The Picton Fairgrounds, we planted a few trees in that area, and Jasper Avenue has received some trees from developer money that was put aside, but the county has also found some other spots and placed additional trees in that area. There's lots of space up there, so we'll see what happens in the future, but that's just tasks we've undertaken so far. We have the adopt tree policy, which was recently implemented. We're excited to get steamrolling on that, get that moving ahead. The idea there is if there's a right-of-way tree that has to come down for some specific reason, it's a hazard tree, it's dropping branches, it's a danger to the public, then we don't want to just cut down. We'd like to add a tree instead. We'd like to do something to keep trees growing in the same place where we're cutting them down. It's not always easy to maintain those trees, especially when they're in the far reaches of the county, and very difficult to have infrastructure to take care of them. So what we're asking for is, again, a partnership with the community. And if you have a tree that comes down from your property and you're able to perhaps water a tree for the first 2 years, its formative years, we ask for assistance with that. And if you can do the watering, we can put the tree in and work together to have more trees around the county. As part of that, we hope to do more community plantings this year, and then the tree giveaway, of course. So a little more on the seedling giveaway. It's April 30th, so that's coming up. It's occurring at Delhi Park as well as the Wellington Community Center. So it'll be around the back of the Wellington Community Center. We have a broad range of different species that we're offering. A bunch of kinds of pines, some cedars, maples, oaks. I believe black cherry is involved in that as well. And one or two others that I'm losing track of right now. So we're giving away 1,000 trees total. It's a limit of 2 per household. So we encourage everyone to come out, grab your trees, take your pick from the variety, and go from there. And there'll be tree planting demonstrations occurring as well. So at 10 o'clock, there'll be one at Delhi Park and another at Wellington. So we have our in-house arborist who will be doing the Wellington one, and Kevin Halloran will be doing the Delhi Park presentation.
So are those bare root trees, or are they black?
Yeah, 1,000 potted trees is the I won't say it's a lot. I would say with our level of infrastructure at the moment, because we're new to this whole thing, it is a lot for us at the moment. But we're not taking anything off the table for the future. Just right now, bare root is the best way to get started. And really, we need to get trees in the ground to sort of address the loss of the ash trees, because it's happening. We're losing them. We will continue to lose them over the next few years. This is just a small way for us to sort of fight that loss where we can.
That's what time that is. What time is it?
Oh, sorry. 8 o'clock until 2 p.m. Both sides.
Set your alarm clocks, they'll probably go quickly.
Well, there is a limit, 2 per household, so I'm not sure that we will see them all go at once, and there is a capacity to the site. We can't handle, 300 people at once, so spreading it out is preferred. And yeah, I think it'll last a while, but with that limit, I think. So.
Are there any smaller trees? Those trees that you mentioned are huge.
There's quite a variety. I think the cedars are smaller, and I'm trying to remember some of the other ones. There's sugar maple, a few different kinds of oaks. We have, what's the one? I can't remember, I'm sorry. My apologies. There's a list of, I think, 10 or 11 different kinds of trees. We did put some PSA out that contains some of that information. So if you saw the public service announcement, there was a list, I believe, provided with that. And I'm happy, if you have not seen that, I'm happy if you want to reach out to me after. I believe my contact information will be put up, and I can answer any questions that you might have. So, also, there's information on the county website as well. Feel free to check out the Sustainability Hub. That's another thing that's come recently, and sort of supporting a lot of these concepts we're talking about today, planting trees and so on. I'm going to turn it over. I think I've probably bored you enough with my voice, so I'll pass it back to Ben here, and he can talk about some of the examples that he's undertaken. So some stuff on public property, on county property, but also some private examples as well.
Yeah, so basically it's looking at sort of projects that I've worked on that are public spaces, so like this, the Wellington Heritage Museum. And then also just looking at sort of some of the techniques that you can take home and try in your own garden, and some of the best plants for different situations. So this is the Wellington Heritage Museum. Has anyone in the room visited this garden at all? So it's in behind the museum. The museum's on Main Street in Wellington. What's the address, Chris? It's right on the Main Street. It's across from the farm yard. Yeah. So it's in behind the museum, and it was planted. What year was that? Maybe 2018, 2017, somewhere around there. So Terra Vista did the design of the garden, so the pathways and beds were all in, and then the Friends of the Heritage Museum approached me about designing the planting. So we did a sort of community planting day in May of, I don't know, 2017 or 2018. And ever since then, it's all been maintained by the Friends, so by volunteers, which is great, with my help on occasion. And it's been a huge success. There are certain plants. So part of the kind of scope of the vision behind the garden was to include plants that had some sort of heritage connection to the county. So in a way, there were plants that were included that are now becoming problems, but they had to be included because they had heritage value. So for example, common yarrow would have been in heritage perennial gardens, but it also seeds and spreads everywhere. So it's a plant where we're now kind of having to intervene a little bit. So it's an interesting kind of hybrid. If it was designed to be nothing but low maintenance, it may look a little different, but it's sort of this combination of trying to be low maintenance, but also have some heritage connection, include some native plants. So it's trying to kind of do a few things at once.
Just a quick thing there, you bring up the dates. I think maybe it's worthwhile just to emphasizing one of the main ingredients for these types of plans being successful is probably a little bit of patience, right? Because they do take time to sort of set up. It's not going to be the first year you're going to have this vibrant, beautiful garden. They do take time to establish. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah.
Or if I'm still your thunder from later.
Well, the interesting thing is, I mean, in this garden, as an example, the soil that was brought in was, fabulously rich triple mix soil. So in a way, the garden matured in probably 2 or 3 years because it's predominantly perennial planting. There are some lilacs and there are some trees that will, fill out over time. But the nice thing with perennials, which is what I'll sort of focus on, is they're basically fully mature at year 3. So whereas trees take sort of decades, you're looking at a much condensed time scale with perennials. So you can have a bit of both. Like the long-term structural stuff is going to take time and you will need the patience, but you can have things that do give you a bit more of an immediate payoff that way. So one of the techniques, and actually this is Sarah's house, Sarah's in the front row. One of the techniques you often see in sort of newly installed landscapes, there's a plant here, and then 2 feet away there's another plant, and 3 feet away there's another plant, and everything in between is mulch. And in a sense that works as long as you keep applying mulch every year in perpetuity forever. The easier way to go is to plant much more densely. So in this woodland garden, we planted on sort of 10 to 12 inch spacing. And the idea is that the plants will cover the ground. You don't need mulch to fill the bare spots in between. So everything was sort of laid out. I augured the holes into the ground here. The only thing we did for prep is I kind of skimmed the turf off underneath the trees, mulched it with a thin layer of compost, and then augured with a sort of power auger thing into the existing soil. So that was it for prep. There was we didn't excavate the soil and bring in new stuff. We just were working with the existing condition. Again, right plant, right place. And there are certain things that have done really well and certain things that didn't do as well. And again, as Sarah can attest, there was one native plant, the heartleaf aster, that did far too well and started to outcompete other things in the garden. So we had to make that decision to intervene and take out the heartleaf aster because we wanted to maintain more diversity in the garden. So if we had just stepped back and walked away, it would have still grown, it would have still been perfectly nice, but it would have diminished in time in terms of the species diversity there. And so this is what it looked like, that same area in year 2. So 2 years after planting, it looks like this, and everything you can see in this picture is a plant that was put there by us. So there's virtually no weeds in this photo. It is a little bit open in the spring before plants wake up, so that's when we get sort of dandelions or little tree seedlings popping into the garden. But really, once the plants kind of fuse over like this and the ground is covered, it's a very, very simple space to maintain. And all we do each year is I sort of run over it with the push mower and mulch everything up in the spring, and that's pretty much it. We'll rake away some of the leaves. If the leaves are really matted and thick in some spots, we'll rake those away. But again, it's not a garden where we're sort of fussing over every individual plant. We kind of treat the whole thing as a sort of plant community. And so that's the same principle at Wellington Museum. So totally different palette of plants, obviously, because here we're in full sun. So there's some chives, there's prairie, eastern bergamot, there's penstemon, wild bergamot, there's asters, fragrant asters that bloom late into the fall. They're amazing plants. They start in October and go into November flowering. So again, for the bees, a nice long season of bloom. This has taken a bit more work, primarily because the soil is so rich. So some plants have grown far too well. There are certain areas that get a bit weedier because the soil is so nice, so the weeds also appreciate that. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is triple mix is not always your friend, because the weeds will also appreciate all that, nutrient and moisture holding capacity. So rich soil is the best way to get sustainable planting on a rich soil, is to plant plants that can really fight with each other, basically. So big, tall, aggressive plants with broad shoulders, I would say. If you try to plant little diminutive things or little delicate ground covers or triple mix, that's fine, they'll grow well, but they'll also quickly get overshadowed by the taller, weedier stuff. So this is sort of a variation on that, the dense planting method. This is a garden in Benson Park that I designed, again, 4 or 5 years ago now. And what I did there is, you can see all the green, the sort of mingling in between the other perennials involves. That's wild strawberry, which is a woodland strawberry actually. So that was planted to do exactly what it's doing here. So it sort of hugs the ground, it doesn't get very tall, so the plants grow up through it and are not bothered by the competition with the strawberry. But the strawberry basically is the mulch. So this was mulched initially at planting time, but it's never been mulched since, because the strawberry does the job. Again, I maintain this garden pro bono more as a kind of data collection point, because I'm trying to see how much maintenance these gardens take in public space. And I weed this 2 to 3 times a year, because the strawberry is so good at keeping any little seedlings or invading plants out. And again, like I said, the other perennials that are in here, there's butterfly weed and coneflowers and daylilies. They just push up through the strawberry there, and they're not bothered by it at all. So that's what it looks like in spring. There's woodland phlox, there's great hyacinths galore. There's scillas creeping in from the lawns, which the squirrels have planted, and now they're kind of creeping into the beds. So They should be in bloom right now. And then later in the summer, next slide, looks like that. So there's woodbed weed, which is a little pink flower there. There's butterfly weed, which is the orange, pale purple coneflower, and then asters that are the tallest plants. They bloom later in the fall. So again, in this picture, the strawberry is still there. It's just sitting in the shade of those plants, acting as the mulch layer, basically. And the last technique, this is a really cool thing. I could do a whole talk just on this, but I've been doing a trial at the Athol Public School in Cherry Valley for the past few years, where I'm looking at planting into gravel and compost, so there's no soil at all. I laboriously hand mixed all of this stuff in the parking lot at the school, like got a load of gravel, a load of compost, mixed it in a wheelbarrow, put it in these test beds, and I'm just trying to see what can grow there in basically gravel with a tiny bit of organic matter. So usually the compost is 20% or less of the mix, so it's like 80% gravel, and in some cases, in a couple of beds, all I did was plant into a 4-inch layer of recycled concrete, which is crushed to sort of a gravel size. And then the plants root into the soil underneath that. And those beds, there's one bed that has stayed weed-free for 4 years. Never had a single weed. And the plants are fine.
What kind of plants do you have in there?
So there's a goldenrod, there's switchgrass, there's Russian sage, catmint.
Monarda?
Not in that
Oh,
pot.
okay.
Yeah, because in other places I mixed the concrete with sand and compost. And that actually acts much more like a soil because now you're mixed in the finer sand and compost and organic matter. So those beds have had more weeds, but the beds that are just recycled concrete have stayed almost weed-free. Now the common yarrow is starting to seed into a couple of them, but yeah, if you can get 2 or 3 years with no weeds in a garden, that's pretty good for public space. So very promising.
And no watering, right?
And no watering, yeah. So I watered these plots initially after planting. So the first round of beds were planted in May, and I watered them through the end of July that year. And then the smaller beds here, these rows, were planted in the fall of that same year. They were watered a couple of times in the fall, but they've never been watered since. So for the past 4 years, they haven't been watered at all. And they still look like this. If anything, there are some plants like the common yarrow that started to self-seed. The little blue stem grass is actually self-seeded, which rarely happens on soil, but it does really well on concrete. So yeah, it's just been a fascinating thing to watch. So that's another technique, is actually not planting into soil, but planting into gravel. So that's what I'm doing on some projects where we have to bring in material. I would rather bring in that than bring in soil, because the soil is going to have weed seeds, and it's going to have, and often we'll have, drought-tolerant plants want drainage and they want to be dry between rainfall. So if you're planting a drought-tolerant garden, topsoil with triple mix is often going to be difficult. It's going to make it harder to accomplish that.
Being out of school, are you getting the kids involved?
I meant to do that. It's sort of one of those things where I'm there more in the summer when the kids aren't there. So I'm sure they're walking around and noticing it, but I haven't really talked to any of the teachers that they're actually taking them out there and looking through it. But it's one of those unfortunate things because they're usually gone by the end of June, which is, the garden still looks good at the end of June, but then they come back in September when it's kind of getting ready to go into dormancy. So the kids are gone during that prime summer winter. Yeah. So I've taken this approach, and this is the garden, the gravel garden at Community Living, which is just over on King Street in Picton, and behind Benson Park. And again, this was planted possibly 4 years ago. So basically, the spring that I did the trials, that fall I planted this garden, which was a major leap of faith because I had no idea if it was actually going to work. And this is a very public, visible space, so it was a bit of a nerve-wracking winter, but it did work. And again, I maintain this as a kind of research plot, and I maintain it 2 or 3 times a year in terms of weeding. Weeding is very minimal, a couple of times in the summer, and then it all gets cut back in the spring. Unfortunately, last fall they were a little bit brutal with it, and the landlord had a guy go in with a weed whacker in the fall when the asters were still in bloom and kind of leaked the whole thing. So we have an understanding now, it's good, but it's one of those, it didn't need to be cut back, but it did
But then when you initially planted that, you said that there was 20% compost in there. Over time,
Yeah.
can you imagine that if this was in someone's garden and you wanted to sustain that, you would have to inject some compost again, a little bit, nothing, just
If anything, I would go with less compost at the start. Because what happens is the worms will work their way up from the soil underneath. So on some of the oldest plots in the trial bed, there's now worm castings on the surface, and it's like black, basically almost topsoil.
But you're also probably chopping and dropping in sight too.
No, so the key thing with these gravel beds is they get cut back and all the material gets taken away. Because if you leave them on the surface, then it starts to biodegrade and you get a soil layer at the surface. So the key thing for reducing weeds is that it has to be really hot and really dry at the surface, which is why gravel is good. Because then a weed seed blows in and it can't germinate because it's sitting in a layer of gravel this deep and it has nothing to do there.
Yeah, and the right plant.
Yeah, right plants, yeah. But this was planted in the fall, so it was planted in September, and the second year, I mean, the asters were planted as little plugs, and by the end of by 1 year later, they were 3 feet across, so it was just incredible. But yeah, the contractor who mixed this up for me delivered it and said, "Do you think anything's going to grow in this ground?" I really hope so, but it did actually work, so that's one of the things that I'm really interested in with public spaces, is using these kinds of materials to make really diverse, long flowering plantings, but plantings that you can maintain a couple of times a year instead of going weekly or bi-weekly or something.
Have you had any success doing this with private gardens?
Yes.
This approach?
Yeah.
So I really like this.
Yeah, the only, so it doesn't work everywhere, because if you have decent soil, I would say work with the soil you have. But if it's a new built house, for example, and you've got to bring in a whole bunch of material, then you can easily bring in this, because you've got to bring something from somewhere. So you might as well start with, a mix of gravel and compost instead, and you've got that cleaner starting point.
And what was there when you started in this particular plant?
It was just a lawn, and again,
Oh, it was
a lawn serving no purpose, because no one's going to go sit on it, so they just cut it all the time, and it was sort of sad in the summer and it browned off, and now it does this instead, which is nice.
What's the pace of change if you have a garden and you do chop and drop and leave the mulch to enrich the soil? Over time, different plants will grow. How many years does it take to go from something like that to something different?
It would probably take a fair amount of time before you notice real change in the soil. But if you were to do that at this garden, like if you were to mulch this all up and leave it all on the surface, you would notice a change in the garden in a couple of years, I'm sure. Because you would get stuff seeding in as that material is decomposing, and it would then start to root into the garden. Now it's still, here it's like a 10-inch depth of gravel and compost over the subsoil. So it still has to go down and grow in that, and there are some plants that wouldn't be able to tolerate it. But
basically, through that changing process, unless you're prepared to weed, you have to weed.
yeah,
Because there's going to be weed.
yeah. So the richer the soil is, generally, the more aggressive the weeds will be. So if you're working in many parts of the county, if you've got like a foot of soil over rock, that's actually a pretty good condition to be working with in terms of weeds. There are lots of plants that can't grow in those conditions, as we all know. But in terms of weed management, like my parents are in Millersburg, and that's the exact condition they're working with. It's rocky clay over bedrock, and I've got all sorts of gardens that I maintain just when I've got a few minutes here and there, because the weeds just literally can't grow that well because there's such thin soil over there. So I'll just go through. Again, I could talk about a million different plants, but I'm trying to limit myself to like a top 10 for different sites. Will this slideshow be available for people to access?
Albert's all right, yeah, for sure.
Because then we don't have to take photos or rhyme off all the words then. But the nodding onion is an allium, fantastic. Butterfly weed is a milkweed. The orange flower one, it's a taproot, so it doesn't spread. Bacteria australis, the false indigo, is a fantastic plant. Once it's established, it will live forever. Kelpie coneflower is really beautiful. Prairie smoke is fantastic. A little ground cover plant that blooms in the spring. Yeah, rough blazing star. The eastern bergamot is a fantastic plant that I've grown in gardens. It's still not but I'm hoping to have some for either the Ameliasburg Garden Club plant sale or possibly at Flora Laura's plant sale in the spring this year. So probably, just a few here and there. But it's an amazing plant. It's a relative of wild bergamot, but it doesn't get the mildew that wild bergamot gets, and it stays much more compact.
What color is the flower on the eastern bergamot?
Sorry, how?
What color is it?
It's sort of like a mauvey purple.
It is a mauvey one, yeah.
Yeah.
Questions about this? I planted some of these, and I think rabbits ate them. I mean, they seem to jump right out.
Which one?
It was the butterfly weed.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Because there are certain plants that. Yeah.
It's just one.
So the thing with butterfly weed is it takes a couple of years to get it established. It's really slow. So if you're starting from a baby plant, it's like 2 or 3 years before it's really filled out because it makes a big deep taproot, which takes time. But then once you've got it forever.
I dug it out and I spread it.
Yeah.
And I planted the seed. I was.
Yeah.
I tried to protect it for a few years.
Yeah, they're buggers. Yeah. I have a whole fenced nursery area at my parents' place specifically because of the bunny problem.
Lost all my rabbits to bunnies this year. All my raspberries to bunnies this year.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just right down to the lawn.
So these are some good ones for richer soils, for soils that hold more moisture in full sun. So in general, what I would recommend is if you've got rich soil in full sun that holds moisture through the summer, which is kind of the key criteria, go for tall, leafy, perennial plants. Little ground covers will just get swamped by other things. So all of these plants, the swamp milkweed, the purple coneflower, especially Joe Pye weed, the mountain mint, they're all plants that get fairly tall and have leaves all the way up the stems, so they can basically push through the tall grass and you'll be able to keep them. If you try to baby little tiny diminutive things on rich soils, it's going to be a lot more work keeping these kind of plants away from them. It's just better to kind of work with things that really want to get nice and big and robust on those soils. And then again, some good ones for shade. Most of these can handle dry shade too, so if you're working under trees with the surface roots of trees sucking up all the rainfall and moisture you get, most of these would be really good. What you tend to get with shade plants is they would either bloom in spring or later in the summer and into the fall. So there isn't much that's in bloom in the woods in the middle of the summer. But that's nothing against it, it's just sort of a greener, quieter season. So most of these would be spring bloomers or fall bloomers. There's a couple of sedges there which are great. They look like grasses, but they're not technically grasses. But they're good little ground covers for shady gardens. The Pennsylvania sedge is a nice lawn alternative, so if you've got areas under trees that can't grow grass, it would probably grow Pennsylvania sedge. And it has the same sort of texture as grass, only gets maybe 6 inches and then sort of mats and falls over. So that's a nice lawn alternative for shade. And then the last slide, so these are things that are called nativars. So they're cultivars, cultivated varieties of native plants. And these are some ones that I've worked with and had really good success with. Again, they're not all available in the trade. Some of these I'm ordering in from the US or getting these little plugs and then growing them on. But all of these are fantastic plants. The aster at the bottom, so the Latin name of aster is now Symphyiotrichum, so big mouthful. But that one is called October Skies, and it's the one that's in community living along with one called Radon's Favorite. And like I said, they start in October and bloom into November, so they're amazing late season plants.
The purple one?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could maybe just speak to a little bit where people could find some of these if they wanted to purchase them.
That's
Providers, that's the big one, right?
Yeah. Condo nurseries and lockers tend to be the kind of biggest sort of retail nurseries. They have pretty good selection on perennials, but what I tend to find the last few years is there's a lot of perennials that last for a couple of years in their catalogs. There's lupins and yarrows and hollyhocks and those sorts of things. They're really nice, beautiful plants, but they don't last forever. So I'm trying to sort of, if we can collectively shift the demand toward perennials that are actual perennials, that would be fantastic. But I will plug Bee from Natural Themes, which is a native plant nursery in Frankfurt, which is fantastic. She's got an amazing selection of native plants, often in small sizes, which is nice, more economical. Yeah, Peter Fuller used to have a native plant nursery in Belleville, but he's sadly not doing it anymore. Actually, he works at Conan now, which is funny. So B. Heisler is her last name, from Natural Themes, is the most local native plant nursery in Frankfurt. You know, in a dream world, I would be that person, but I'm just not quite there yet. So,
The conservation authority sells kits of wildflowers.
yeah, and I think they might source them from B. Natural Themes, but yeah.
There's an outfit called the Wildflower Farm.
Yeah.
In Aurelia, who are an amazing source.
Yeah, they do seed mixes too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They've been in business for a long time. They're really good at stuff.
Yeah. There's another one called Grow Wild in Peterborough, but I'm not sure if he sells to the public.
He only sells wholesale now.
Yeah, okay, so never mind. Sorry.
Natural plants is, it's in Claremont, just north of.
Oh, yeah. That's Oshawa, yeah. Just getting further and further away.
Yeah, that's, maybe go to your world.
Yeah. I will have a few of these. They'll be very small quantities, but